Everyone, welcome to Save News TV. Today we're going to catch up on this committee hearing from the Homeland Security on how transactional criminal organizations profit from the human trafficking at the southern border. And we will definitely be watching this. They are having several hearings regarding this matter.
On Border Security and Enforcement and the Subcommittee on Emergency Management and Technology will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare the committee in recess at any point. The purpose of this hearing is to examine the ways transnational criminal organizations engage in human trafficking solely for profit, disregarding the dignity of human life. To protect the most vulnerable, we must work together to develop a better understanding of how current border policies have enabled transnational criminal organizations to conduct large-scale human trafficking at the southwest borders, and how can we develop effective solutions to this tragedy that unfolds at our southern border. I now recognize the ranking member for the Subcommittee on Border Security and Enforcement, the gentleman from California, Mr. Correa, my friend and colleague, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Higgins and Chairman D'Esposito, thank you for this most important hearing on human trafficking and human smuggling. I'll start out by summarizing the difference between human smuggling and human trafficking. Human smuggling is a crime against the United States and occurs when a person pays for service like transportation or fraudulent documents in order to enter a country illegally, versus human trafficking, which is a crime of exploitation. It occurs when someone uses force, fraud, or coercion to compel another person to work or engage in the sex or trade of forced labor. Human trafficking can happen in any industry, any age, date, gender, nationality. Department of State estimates there's almost 28 million people that are victims of human trafficking at any given time worldwide. And sadly, many of those individuals are hidden right in front of us. Unfortunately, we do not realize the full magnitude of this problem due to its hidden nature of the crime. And for decades, this country has been unable to gather the statistics needed to understand the scale of this problem. Human trafficking is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and transnational criminal organizations, or TCOs, are preying on vulnerable individuals to make a dollar. Not only do TCOs traffic vulnerable people, but family members, strangers, and friends are also engaged in this business, all to make a buck. The separate issue of human smuggling, we know that TCOs prey on vulnerable migrants coming to this country who are seeking protection, freedom, and hope of a better life for themselves and their families. We've all read about the reports, briefings, and have visited Latin America, and we know why migrants are fleeing their country. They're being forced by violence, prosecution, effectively starvation. And many parents are forced to choose whether their children will join a local criminal gang or make the tough decision to send them northward through the jungles of Central America and through the treacherous parts of Mexico, all to reach the border. And all of us have seen the Facebook posts, TikTok, YouTube, videos showing human smugglers deceiving people into thinking that freedom and safety is just a few payments away, when we know that's not true. And that's why it's imperative to fight against the disinformation campaigns of these traffickers. To fight against TCOs, human trafficking, and human smuggling, we must engage in comprehensive solutions. And I commend the Biden administration, Secretary Mayorkas, and DHS for building one of the strongest anti-human trafficking responses in the world that focuses on prevention, consequences, and international cooperation. And that's why I'm concerned that my colleagues, at a recent press release, claimed that President Biden and Secretary Mayorkas have been working in partnership with cartels. And I got to say that we may disagree on how to get the job done, but I think we all kind of agree on the objective, which is stop these criminal organizations and to stop these individuals from being victimized. Now, I would say that instead of using rhetoric, we members of Congress should be working together to create comprehensive solutions to combat these crimes, these huge crimes in their magnitude. Comprehensive solutions mean developing strong legislation in a bipartisan manner to combat these criminals. It means investing and working with our federal, state, and local levels, police agencies to support anti-trafficking organizations. And it means also strengthening our partnerships with our international partners who will support us in fighting TCOs. A good example is Chairman here, Mr. Higgins, and myself working on legislation called the Cooperation on Combating Human Smuggling and Trafficking Act. One step in the right direction. This is not a U.S. problem. This is a global problem. TCOs, or transnational criminal organizations, and see the desperation of people fleeing war, corruption, and economic conditions that are dire as a way to get rich. We need to partner with our neighbors to the south, north, and across the globe to end these heinous trafficking crimes. Today, I want to thank our witnesses for joining us today, and I look forward to hearing their recommendations on how we in Congress can help end these trafficking crimes and protect the vulnerable populations who prey on these individuals here and abroad. With that, I yield, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ranking Member Correa. I now recognize the chairman for the Subcommittee on Emergency Management and Technology, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Desposito, for his opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you and Ranking Member Correa for so kindly allowing today's hearing to be a joint hearing with the Emergency Management and Technology Subcommittee. I would also like to thank our esteemed panel of witnesses for joining us here today. I'm looking forward to having a meaningful discussion about how the Department of Homeland Security and the United States government can fight against transnational criminal organizations booming the human trafficking business, both here in the United States and along smuggling routes in Latin America. As I am sure we would all agree, human trafficking is an evil which should be eradicated. It is the use of force, fraud, or coercion to exploit someone else for personal gain. It is, in its very nature, dehumanizing, selfish, and cruel. Put simply, traffickers prey on vulnerability and they profit from pain. To some Americans, the reality and dangers of human trafficking may only seem like a plot for a good movie or some faraway and minuscule reality. However, that is simply not the case. While human trafficking is a hidden crime, it is estimated that 27.6 million men, women, and children are currently victims of human trafficking, whether by powerful criminal organizations or by individuals who simply take advantage of others' misfortune. With this in mind, it is important that we explore the reality between the Biden administration's failure to secure the southern border and how TCOs take advantage of migrants on their journey to the United States of America and after they arrive. Transnational criminal organizations make billions of dollars each year off human trafficking alone. And while human smuggling does not cause human trafficking, the two are correlated. A recent ABC article demonstrated that the surge of migration is directly tied to the TCO's recruitment of migrants for their, quote, big business of human smuggling. While migrants pay cartels thousands of dollars to be smuggled into the United States of America, these TCOs often exploit, sexually abuse, and traffic the same migrants who paid them. Tragically, women and children, including unaccompanied minors, bear the brunt of this abuse. The truth is that open borders empower TCOs to take advantage of migrants' vulnerability, and once across the border, many migrants continue to be at risk of being trafficked. With the growing number of migrants overwhelming cities in the United States, the current humanitarian crisis is only putting more individuals at risk of being trafficked. Housing instability, a lack of support system, and financial pressure all make migrants vulnerable to trafficking. While states like Texas and Arizona have had to manage the border crisis for years, every state, under the failed policies of Biden and Mayorkas, are now becoming a border state. My home state of New York is no exception. Since the spring of 2022, more than 100,000 migrants have passed through New York City, and it is estimated that more than 58,000 individuals still remain in the city's care. The mayor of the city of New York, Eric Adams, has previously stated that the city has already spent more than $1.45 billion to address the migrant crisis, and that New York City could potentially spend $12 billion to address the migrant crisis over the next 3 fiscal years. It is glaringly apparent that the city is inadequately prepared to house or provide services to the growing number of migrants. The mayor's response has been to put migrants in already overcrowded homeless shelters and hospitals, JFK Airport, and a tent city at Randall's Island, just to name a few locations. The lack of planning when it comes to migrant housing is extremely concerning, given that we know about the human trafficking risk factors. In 2021, Polaris, the operator of the National Human Trafficking Hotline, published a report that found that migration or relocation and unstable housing are both major risk factors that can make an individual more vulnerable to human trafficking. New York City and the Long Island area have one of the highest rates of human trafficking in the country. According to the New York State Division of Criminal Justice Services, between 2008 and 2021, local authorities have made 58 human trafficking arrests, 24 in my home county of Nassau, and 34 in the bordering county and the home to Congressman Nick LaLota in Suffolk County. Given the fact that the current administration continues to do nothing to address the migrant crisis, I am deeply concerned that this lack of resources and planning will lead to an increase in the number of individuals being trafficked. Furthermore, in the Long Island area, gang activity can also contribute to the risk of individuals being trafficked. As highlighted in a Washington Post article from last year, the gang MS-13 has, quote, increasingly turned to sex trafficking over the past decade to generate income alongside drug trafficking. MS-13, which has operated on Long Island since 2003, many have been convicted of dozens of murders in the region and is considered one of the most violent criminal organizations on Long Island. I hope for the sake of all those being impacted by this crisis that we are able to come together to find meaningful solutions. Again, I thank you all for being here today. I thank the chairman and the ranking member, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Chairman Desposito.
Mr. Chairman.
I now recognize myself for my opening statement. Today we'll be examining and uncovering how transnational criminal organizations commit heinous and incalculable horrors in their trafficking schemes across our southwest border and deep into the United States. Human traffickers are part of a large network of vicious, evil organizations that exploit vulnerable people for profit. The Biden administration has unwittingly facilitated cartel operations at the southern border, and as a result, we face a human trafficking crisis. Cartels have been emboldened, and migrants have been victimized. The most vulnerable, including children, have become targets for cartels and violent gangs who prey on them for forced labor or sexual exploitation and slavery. It's important to recognize the key differences between human smuggling and human trafficking. Human smuggling is a crime of unlawful movement of human beings. On the other hand, human trafficking is a coercive crime against a victim by force, usually through forced labor or sexual exploitation. As criminal cartels continue to exploit our borders, human trafficking will only worsen. Smuggling can and does lead to trafficking. Transnational criminal organizations charge migrants thousands or even tens of thousands of dollars to be smuggled across the border, with many being unable to pay and subsequently forced into sex, drug, and labor trafficking rings. I'd like to recognize the Board of Security Subcommittee's bipartisan effort to combat this evil. Earlier this year, Ranking Member Correa and I introduced H.R. 4574, the Cooperation on Combating Human Smuggling and Trafficking Act, which seeks to enhance border security by expanding partnerships with law enforcement entities in Mexico, Central America, and South America to combat human smuggling and trafficking operations. In the last Congress, this committee introduced the Countering Human Trafficking Act of 2022, which provided statutory authority for the Center for Countering Human Trafficking within the Department of Homeland Security. The border crisis has facilitated an immigration crisis in the United States and has allowed criminal cartels to prosper by exploiting the most vulnerable individuals. Criminal cartels have expanded to operate global enterprises where each migrant is viewed as a commodity in which these criminal cartels are able to profit. I look forward to working with my colleagues as we work to fight human trafficking, strengthen our border security, and bring these criminals at the border to justice. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses, and I yield my own opening statement. Mr. Carter, the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Emergency Management and Technology, the gentleman from Louisiana, has not been able to join us yet today, but he will hopefully while we're still in attendance here. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record.
Wanted to ask unanimous consent to include Ranking Member Carter's opening statement for the record.
Without objection.
Thank you.
I thank the ranking member. I'm pleased to welcome our panel of witnesses, and I ask that our witnesses please rise and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you will give before the Committee on Homeland Security of the United States House of Representatives will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. Thank you, and please be seated. I'd like now to formally introduce our witnesses. Ambassador John Cotton Richmond is an attorney and diplomat focused on ethical business, human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. Previously, Ambassador Richmond served as a U.S. ambassador to monitor and combat trafficking in persons from 2018 to 2021. Serving in the nation's highest-ranking position dedicated to human trafficking, he led U.S. foreign policy related to modern slavery and coordinated the U.S. government's response to these crimes. Our next witness, Mr. Pablo Villeda, is International Justice Mission's Regional President of Latin America, and the gentleman oversees their work to rescue children who have been victimized by sexual violence and to secure justice against human traffickers and those who would exploit the vulnerable for sexual trade. Mr. Villeda joined International Justice Mission as Guatemala's Field Office Director, where he led a team to achieve significant convictions against perpetrators of sexual violence, and he pioneered new ways of combating child sexual assault by equipping officials within the Guatemalan justice system with what they needed to fight back. I'd like to recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Correa, to introduce a minority witness, Mr. Terry Fitzpatrick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman Higgins and Chairman D'Esposito. It's my honor to introduce Mr. Terry Fitzpatrick. A journalist by training, Mr. Fitzpatrick has been involved in the fight against human trafficking for over a decade. He has award-winning coverage on human rights and criminal justice. He's also helped produce films about human trafficking in 14 countries around the world. And he currently serves as the director of the Alliance to End Slavery and Trafficking, also known as ATTEST, a coalition advocating for solutions to end human trafficking. Thank you, Mr. Fitzpatrick, for being here today. Look forward to hearing your statement, sir. Mr. Chairman.
Thank the ranking member. Our final witness, Dr. Jared Sadolski, has over 20 years of law enforcement experience, including counter-human trafficking, counterterrorism, homeland security, and local law enforcement. Dr. Sadolski has spent time in Central America and South America researching both human trafficking and international narcotics trafficking. I thank the witnesses for being here today. The witnesses' full statements will appear in the record. I now recognize Ambassador Richmond for 5 minutes to summarize his opening statement.
Chairman Higgins, Ranking Member Correa, Chairman D'Esposito, thank you for allowing us to appear here today. I currently serve as the Chief Impact Officer for Atlas Free, a network of over 40 anti-trafficking organizations working to combat trafficking around the world. I'm also the president of the Libertas Council, a leadership community focused on combating human trafficking, advancing democracy, and affirming human dignity. The members have wisely highlighted that traffickers profit from human trafficking. And this is not the noble profits of a market-based enterprise in a fair capitalist system. These are the illicit economic gains from treating inherently valuable people as disposable commodities. And whenever the issue of the border arises in conversations about human trafficking, I think it's wise to clarify the distinction between smuggling and trafficking. Smuggling is a crime of transportation. It can be voluntary or involuntary, and it violates the integrity of a country's borders. Trafficking, however, is always involuntary. Coercion is at the very heart of the crime, and there is no legal requirement that a person crosses a border to be a victim of human trafficking. In fact, the UN estimates that over 70% of all the victims in the world, that their traffickers actually exploit them in their own country of origin. This isn't to suggest that borders don't matter. They do. It's just that illegal border crossings do not cause human trafficking. They do, however, make people much more vulnerable. And traffickers prey on vulnerable people because traffickers believe that vulnerable people are easier to coerce and exploit. And many things make people vulnerable. People who are in poverty, illiteracy, disabilities, lack of strong families, all these things can make individuals vulnerable to crime, including the crime of trafficking. As Chairman D'Esposito said, border crossings are correlated, but they're not causal to trafficking. There's only one cause of human trafficking, one true root cause of trafficking, and that is the trafficker's decision to exploit another person. When people talk about going upstream, they often focus on just reducing vulnerabilities. And while noble, these efforts have at best an indirect impact on human trafficking because they're focused on the correlated vulnerabilities and not the true root cause of trafficking. The government's failure to enforce laws benefits criminals. This is true not only of border laws, but it's also true of trafficking laws. The U.S. State Department highlighted the plummeting rate of human trafficking law enforcement last year. According to the State Department, the United States only initiated 162 new federal human trafficking prosecutions last year. New prosecutions have not been that low since 2014. U.S. federal courts only convicted 256 human traffickers last year, a 48% decrease since 2019. And although strong and effective criminal justice response to trafficking alone will not solve the problem. It is a necessary component of a holistic approach. The failure to fund and resource the hardworking people of the Department of Justice and Homeland Security to enforce our trafficking laws means that human traffickers are operating with impunity. Pair the awful reality with the dramatic increase in vulnerable, undocumented people, and human trafficking becomes a high-reward, low-risk criminal enterprise. And we're not only dealing with the government's failure to enforce border laws concerning individuals, the United States is also failing to stop companies from importing goods made by forced labor victims. The teams at DHS charged with enforcing both the Tariff Act and the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act must be allowed to stop slave-made goods from tarnishing United States markets. Congress must decide if it will take a consistent approach to human rights or only engage in soaring rhetoric when it's convenient to other priorities. With almost all the solar panels crossing United States borders having been stained by China forcing Uyghur minorities to work, we have to ask if America wants to go green on the back of slave labor. We have to ask if chocolate Halloween treats are worth traffickers forcing children from Mali and Burkina Faso to work in fields. Forced labor interferes with free markets and it undermines capitalism. For individuals to flourish, people must be free to decide where they work and who touches their bodies. Congress should move quickly to reauthorize the international provisions of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act and to create vacatur and expungement pathways for trafficking survivors. The United States should screen every undocumented person for indicators of trafficking as it humanely enforces its border laws and prevents the surge of vulnerable individuals for traffickers to target. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions in this discussion today.
Thank you, Ambassador. I now recognize Mr. Villeda for 5 minutes to summarize his opening statement.
Chairman Higgins, Ranking Member Correa, Chairman Desposito, and distinguished members of the subcommittees, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. My name is Pablo Villeda Ortiz, and I serve as Regional President for Latin America at International Justice Mission. In Latin America, we work in Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Peru, Colombia, Bolivia, and we recently concluded a 10-year project addressing sex trafficking of children in the Dominican Republic. Before joining IJM as Guatemala Field Office Director in 2007, I practiced law inspired by my father, who dedicated his life as a lawyer to help many people in need. But I grew up in safety, free from fear of crime. But I knew that was not the experience of millions of others. I witnessed this first when I worked as a law clerk in Guatemala's justice system. I saw that those living in poverty did not have real access to justice. And then in my capacity at IJM, I met many survivors of violence who expect little protection from their justice systems. The title of this hearing suggests a broken path. If such a path exists, it is indeed broken, broken from the outset. Broken in the communities of millions of people in Latin America for whom violence is a never-present danger. The rule of law is only a notion, and actually impunity is the norm. So in the face of these challenges, we must look to the source and then work to address factors that drive people to abandon their communities. IJM's experience in Latin America, where we work in partnership with justice system officials, is that progress is possible and has not been seriously undermined by leadership transitions or corruption. Local governments, of course, must be held responsible for extending the protection of the rule of law to all, but especially those living in poverty, so that they are safe within their own communities, and there are proven effective ways to achieve this end. For example, as a result of IJM's program in the Dominican Republic, we have seen a 78% reduction in the prevalence of sex trafficking of children in the Dominican Republic. We are convinced that when a justice system protects its most vulnerable and treats victims with dignity, they report crimes. Perpetrators are held accountable. Violence is deterred and the cycle of abuse is broken. It is then when victims become survivors and flourish, and people can live peacefully within their own communities without the need to seek a life elsewhere. The United States has a pivotal role to counter violence as a fundamental factor that creates instability, drives migration, and makes people vulnerable to trafficking. And toward that end, and as I close, I would like to offer 3 recommendations. First, we encourage the United States to continue to partner with and invest in local governments in Latin America. Continued partnership between governments can significantly improve the performance of criminal justice systems so that they are responsive to violence. Secondly, we encourage the United States to increase diplomatic efforts to address violence against women and children in partnership with the government of Honduras. In January 2023, the United States and Honduran governments announced their intention to sign a joint memorandum of understanding that defines specific actions against domestic and gender-based violence, while also increasing support to survivors. IJM encourages the Department of State to work with the government of Honduras to finalize and commence such a joint statement. And finally, we urge members of Congress to reauthorize the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. September 30th marked 2 years since the previous authorization of the international TVPA programs expired. But last week, the bipartisan Frederick Douglass Trafficking Victims Prevention and Protection Act, H.R. 5856, was passed by the House Foreign Affairs Committee. If enacted, it would reauthorize key provisions of the TVPA. We encourage members of this committee to co-sponsor and vote in support of that bill. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify before you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Villeda. Mr. Fitzpatrick, you're recognized for 5 minutes to summarize your opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman Higgins and Esposito and Ranking Member Correa, and to all the members of the committee for allowing me to speak today. Just one thing to say about the Alliance to End Slavery and Trafficking, so you know who we are. We're an alliance of organizations that conduct programs in more than 30 U.S. cities and 100 countries. And we advocate for stronger federal laws and increased federal funding to prevent and combat forced labor and human trafficking. I think the most important thing that would be the takeaway from my remarks today is this: whole of government solutions, comprehensive, holistic solutions are needed to defeat trafficking. And I'd like to take a few moments to explain what we view that means at the border. I have 3 issue areas and 3 recommendations. Issue 1 is some context. Some statistics I've seen is it's actually only 15% of trafficking victims around the world today are actually migrants. So not all forced labor and human trafficking is related to migration. A significant number of individuals are trapped that way. That 15% adds up to about 4 million people worldwide. Not a small number, but putting it into a larger context. Unfortunately, there are no authoritative numbers for inside the United States. The National Institute of Justice is doing some research on that. But it is known that migration-related trafficking reaches beyond undocumented individuals. For example, the National Human Trafficking Hotline, run by Polaris, has received thousands of calls for help from migrants inside the U.S. legally on guest worker visas or already in asylum protected status. Lastly, for context, it's American businesses who ultimately profit from transnational human trafficking. American farms and factories exploit migrant children in illegal child labor, and migrant adults trapped in illegal debt bondage are generating profits for American corporations. Issue 2, the need for prevention and protection. Law enforcement isn't the only solution. Foreign assistance programs can help reduce the number of individuals fleeing their home countries. Increasing the capacity to properly process migrants can reduce trafficking vulnerability. That's because long delays at legal points of entry can cause desperate individuals to seek irregular pathways and become trafficking targets. There's an urgent need at the border for more asylum officers, immigration judges, child welfare specialists, and attorneys. As well, to protect migrants already here, there is a need for increased workplace inspections by the Labor Department and reform of guest worker visa rules. Issue 3, the protection of American values and leadership. Migrants not only seek opportunity in the United States, they seek safety and freedom. Our answer to those fleeing forced labor and human trafficking abroad must not be to go back. Congress has ensured that the U.S., perhaps more than any other country, embraces a whole-of-government vision for counter-trafficking programs. However, at the border in particular, our nation is not living up to that holistic ideal. Quickly, 3 recommendations. I will echo the recommendation to please pass the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, the TVPRA. To improve international trafficking prevention, this bill will require the integration of anti-trafficking strategies into programs, all programs, at the U.S. Agency for International Development, with financial earmarks for countries in Central America, where a lot of the unaccompanied minor push factors are sending children to our southern border. To protect trafficking survivors in the U.S., the bill reauthorizes programs at the Department of Health and Human Services. There's a companion bill in the Senate, S-920, with additional provisions to protect migrants. When it comes over for passage, we urge you to pass that as well. Recommendation 2, enact key provisions of the FY24 Emergency Supplemental Appropriations Request. The border supplemental includes additional asylum officers and immigration judges, increased social services, and tougher enforcement of U.S. child labor law. As well, please hold the line on trafficking funding throughout the federal budget. With all the public attention, with movies and news reports about child labor in American factories, the response from Congress cannot be, we're going to slash funding for anti-trafficking programs. Lastly, recommendation 3, do not roll back protections for unaccompanied child migrants. All children deserve screening by specially trained border personnel, not streaming by lesser trained immigration adjudicators. I look forward to explaining a little bit more about those recommendations and any questions you might have. Thank you much.
Thank you, Mr. Fitzpatrick. Dr. Sadolski, you recognized for 5 minutes to summarize your opening statements, sir.
Chairman Higgins, Ranking Member Correa, Chairman D'Esposito, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today and to provide this testimony on human trafficking. As a doctor of criminal justice, a professor at American Military University, as well as a humanitarian, I've been conducting research on human trafficking trends in Latin America for several years. This work has led me to in-country research in South America, Central America, and the United States. As a guest of Interpol and the National Police of Colombia, I've conducted in-country research on human trafficking originating in Colombia, and I've also conducted in-country research in 4 years of humanitarian work in Central America. Specifically, the humanitarian work that I've engaged in has involved leading teams to provide training to the staff and inmates of a prison in Latin America, and specifically in Belize. Through this humanitarian work and working within the prison system of the nation's only prison, I've had the opportunity to interview and to speak with former convicted human traffickers, as well as through my research, I've had the opportunity to speak to many human trafficking victims. So today, the information that I'm presenting is a culmination of that research. There's a dangerous nexus between human smuggling and trafficking, though they're very distinct. People who are initially attempting to be smuggled in the United States can end up as trafficking victims. This occurs because of the obstacles and delays that can occur on the smuggling route and resulting in the migrant owing more money than what they have in order to pay. When that happens, they're forced into human trafficking as a means to pay off their debt once they arrive to the southwest border. This can include sex trafficking, packaging drugs in safe houses or stash houses near the border, and other forms of forced labor. For groups of people that are being smuggled into the United States, or I'm sorry, smuggled toward the southwest border, intelligence is collected from within the group. For example, you'll have a coyote, which is a smuggler himself, mixed within the migrant group that is there to collect intelligence to see who actually has the money. Once it's determined that a migrant does not have the funds to continue the process of getting to the southwest border, they're often sold to actual human traffickers for exploitation. Stash houses have an important role in human trafficking along the southwest border. They occur on both the U.S. and Mexican side. TCOs use local gang members to manage the staff houses on both sides. Safe houses could be described as a triangle, with the first house being a processing center where those forced into human trafficking are processed by having their photograph taken, the amount of debt owed is listed, as well as their personal items, passports, even clothing are taken away from them. From there, the second house that is part of this stash house triangle is where the actual exploitation occurs. A lot of that, although we focus on sex trafficking and forced labor, a lot of that involves packaging narcotics that are flowing through the southwest border. Once the debt is paid, then the victim is transferred to a third safe house. It is there they're given back their property, as well as given the opportunity to make it to their destination. TCOs create an illusion that no crime is being committed, and instead they're just attempting to have people find a better life. The system is set up to detect illegal narcotics, more so at the southwest border than it is human smuggling or trafficking. Many TCOs depend on connections that aid in the facilitation of human trafficking, that provide blanket security for everyone involved through tipping them off of law enforcement operations or other threats to their operations. One element of human trafficking that's not well known is organ harvesting. Sadly, part of my humanitarian work in Central America has revealed that there's a market for juvenile organs. One particular person that I had interviewed was involved in human trafficking at several different levels and was able to provide insight into some of these inner workings, specifically with organ trafficking. The reason why organ harvesting has become a market is due to a buyer's personal needs. For example, if someone has a family member that's dying and is unable to obtain that organ legally, they'll basically provide a custom order for a specific organ. Organ traffickers view this exploitation as a job. The former gang member who was involved in the trafficking spoke of one organ trafficker out of Mexico, Venezuela, and the Philippines. The organ trafficker would frequent homeless shelters, other shelters, encampments, and drug houses where families camped with their children. He would offer money to the parents to take the children out of that environment, and the children would never return. In one particular case, there was a 12-year-old that someone paid $15,000 for his eye. This was several years ago. The organ trafficker explained that moving children from one point to another is easy because the trafficker doesn't have to show documentation, and he did not receive resistance from the child because the parents gave permission for the child to be with the trafficker. Human trafficking continues to be a global problem due to its profitability. When a drug dealer makes a profit through selling drugs, they have to go obtain more product to make another sale. In the case of human trafficking, the same victim is exploited over and over, and the victim is able to transport themselves. Thank you for the opportunity, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Sadolski. Members will be recognized by order of seniority for their 5 minutes of questioning. An additional round of questioning may be called after all members have been recognized. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. Gentlemen, thank you for your opening statements. We are in a new era of impact from illegal crossings at our southern border. We're pushing 3 years now with change in policy. That's normal with the new administration, but the Biden administration's inauguration, it seemed to coincide with perhaps the closing of the COVID era and an introduction of enhanced migration for various reasons across the world. But the policies of the Biden administration have, I believe, unwittingly facilitated the business models of the cartels who thrive on human misery and human trafficking and drug trafficking. I think things are getting so bad in America that even the existing criminal networks have been around for decades, in the illegal sex trafficking business, a lot of which is sort of semi-voluntary. People get pulled into criminal networks for various reasons in life, but it's not the same as slavery. It's not the same as being pulled so deep into a criminal network that you no longer exist as a human being. You're being pulled from a human being that has been drawn into a life of crime on the street because of many factors. It's bad. I had a CI call me a couple of years ago from a guy in New Orleans, and as you gentlemen know, most confidential informants are, they're on the edge of the criminal networks themselves. They're homeless, they have drug issues, etc. I had a CI call me. He said, "Cap, something's happening out here that's real bad that he's never seen before in all of his years on the street." He said he was offered in the middle of the night one night. He was offered a woman for $2,500. And he didn't understand that because it was a very high price to hear on the street. And the man making that offer explained, "No, that's to own the woman. Like, she's yours." He was selling a human being, not access to a human being or illegal sexual trafficking of that human being for a period of time. We're talking about owning a human being. So even the criminal networks are recognizing that America is being pulled into a darkness we've never seen before. Ambassador, you mentioned that traffickers are operating with impunity. And Mr. Villeda, you mentioned a 78% reduction of child trafficking after a campaign of prosecution. I would like you two gentlemen, please, in the remainder of my time, a minute and a half, beginning with you, Ambassador Richmond, please respond to what would happen with the cartels and criminal networks business model if we began aggressively prosecuting in the United States child trafficking and putting a lot of people behind bars that are currently operating, as you described it, with impunity. Mr. Richmond?
Chairman, I think there is little doubt that when there is no rule of law or when laws are not enforced, it benefits traffickers' business models. It takes away the risk. If prosecutions were increased, if investigations were increased, particularly trauma-informed prosecutions where we have both agents as well as prosecutors who understand the impacts of trauma on victims and understand how to investigate this economically motivated crime, I think there could be a significant impact on traffickers' operations, particularly if those increased prosecutions are paired with thoughtful trauma-informed protection services for the survivors to make sure that they get the care they need, and wraparound services for those survivors. And if we can do both, prosecutions and protection services, I think you'll see a much more successful.
So a significant impact you mentioned, and Mr. Villeda, you had cited a 78% reduction. Would you please touch on that briefly, sir?
We noticed in the Dominican Republic that with focused, targeted investments in capacity building of law enforcement and prosecution, the crime of human trafficking reacts and diminishes to the enforcement of the laws. So we actually saw a 78% reduction in the Dominican Republic in the sex trafficking of children, and we have seen similar results in other projects around the world.
Thank you, Mr. Villeda and Mr. Richmond, for your answers. My time has expired. I recognize the ranking member, my friend and colleague, Mr. Correa, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have to say to the witnesses that your comments are very sobering. It reminds us of the challenges ahead of us as a society, as a country. And I agree with the chairman. We have a new era, as he would say, of impact. Refugees. Is this a U.S. issue or global issue? Colombia is now looking at not 2.5, but 3 million Venezuelan refugees. They're bursting at the seams. Costa Rica, I met with the president 2 weeks ago and said the same thing. I've got a challenge with the refugees within our borders and how to deal with the maintenance, sustainability. Mexico is saying the same thing. We have policy changes, possibly, as the chairman has said. We also have COVID that devastated a lot of countries in the world, especially in Latin America. Honduras, well, the respect to the Honduran president and the others, is really a failed economy right now. COVID devastated them, and they really don't have a plan on how to get out of their economic woes. I think the said could be said for many other countries, especially in Latin America. We have got wars, and they're driving people, Middle East as well as in Europe. Year and a half ago, I was in Tijuana receiving a lot of the Ukrainian refugees as they were being processed into the U.S. So I'm going to ask you, with each one of you, with Ambassador Richmond, is this a U.S. challenge or is this a world challenge? Very quickly, sir.
Well, clearly, trafficking is a global challenge.
Mr. Villeda.
It is a global challenge. Countries have to
Mr.
work
Fitzpatrick.
Global, absolutely.
Mr. Salisbury. And I'm going off my notes because, frankly, like the chairman says, new era of impact. And I'm trying to figure out what's going to stop this. Building a wall. Do you think building a wall is going to help? Mr. Richmond.
I think we need every possible intervention to stop
Mr.
trafficking.
Villeda.
We need comprehensive solutions, sir.
Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Comprehensive, a wall might create more trafficking than it might stop.
Mr. Sandusky.
I believe it needs to be an all hands on deck approach, and I think that would include a wall.
And thank you. And the reason I'm asking these questions at big global scale is that this thing is going to get worse before it gets better. You know, the more testimony I hear from you, the experts, these economies are not getting any better. They're getting worse. And Chairman put together a trip to Central America to go see the Darien Gap just a few weeks ago that had to be rescheduled. But, you know, I think the most dangerous part of this trip is not the Darien Gap. It's traveling through Mexico. By the time most of those victims reach the border, and I say victims of human trafficking and smuggling, 80% of those women are either raped or sexually assaulted. And for people to be that desperate to take that trip north tells you people in a dire situation, and I don't see things getting any better in Central America or a lot of those other Latin American countries. So, you know, I'm going to ask each one of you again, what's the answer? Mr. Richmond. Third.
The answer is to bring hope to the victims by actually enforcing our laws and providing them
But you
services.
got to feed them too. Hunger is a great motivator. Mr. Villeda.
Hunger is a motivator, but not the only one. If they would have the opportunity to feel safe in their own communities, many people would rather stay.
Mr. Fitzpatrick.
I just want to make a comment about prosecution. It's who attention on prosecuting coyotes or transporters who are moving people for trafficking, but it's factory owners and agricultural farm owners who are actually exploiting people on the land. So prosecution needs to be thought of.
What about the banking system? What about the financial services system that actually transact and transfer money from the victims to organized crime?
Sure, the FinCEN system has been designed, and the Liechtenstein Initiative has been designed to help look for illicit transnational transactions. So there's a conference right now.
Dr. Sildensky, my last 9 seconds.
Yes, sir. I believe it comes down to international collaboration between governments, as well as NGOs, as well as education to the migrants themselves, because I think there's a misconception in some areas of Latin America of the dangers of coming across to the United States. For example, a migrant that I recently spoke to explained that he was unaware of how dangerous it was going to be. He spoke of children and adult skeletal remains that he saw scattered throughout the route. And these are things that I think that a lot of migrants are not aware of in terms of the dangers, and I believe that is one part of the solution.
Mr. Chairman, I want to thank the witnesses for their testimony today, and I yield.
I thank the ranking member. I recognize Chairman Desposito, the gentleman from New York, for 5 minutes for questioning.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you again for being here this afternoon. Ambassador, in your witness testimony, you share how, although, and you say, poverty, illiteracy, disabilities, and lack of strong families, end quote, are conditions that create vulnerability. These conditions are not the causes of human trafficking. They are vulnerabilities that traffickers exploit. Can you elaborate on this for us? What are the root causes of human trafficking?
I think it's a really important distinction. Vulnerabilities are real and they matter. And many, many things can make communities and individuals vulnerable. And we mentioned that some of those. Poverty. I think our foster care system leaves people quite vulnerable. I think there's illiteracy, the lack of strong families. All of these things make people vulnerable. Criminals target vulnerable people, and traffickers, as economically motivated criminals, are going to target the people that are easiest in their mind to coerce and control. People who are without legal status to be present in the United States have a special vulnerability. When I was a federal prosecutor at the Department of Justice and part of the Human Trafficking Prosecution Unit, I prosecuted traffickers that intentionally targeted undocumented, vulnerable individuals because they believed they would be easier to control. I think the important idea is it's good to work to reduce vulnerabilities in general, but that is an indirect approach to stopping trafficking because the root cause of trafficking are the criminals who commit the crime, the women and men who decide they're going to treat inherently valuable people as disposable commodities.
Thank you. And I think what's important here is, and the chairman pointed out, is this is especially for many of the communities that we represent that are seeing human trafficking, this is a new era of crime. And both of us coming from law enforcement, the chairman mentioned still speaking to some CIs, and I've had the same experiences. This is a new era of crime, and even some of the most seasoned criminals and perps on the street do not understand how this is changing our communities. So on that note, how do TCOs and traffickers benefit from the current lack of law enforcement and border security, especially on our southern border?
I think that any criminal, whether it's an individual or it's a transnational criminal organization, are going to benefit when laws are not enforced. And I don't want to overstate that law enforcement alone is sufficient. It's just right now we have such stunningly low numbers of law enforcement in terms of people actually being arrested and prosecuted and held accountable for the heinous crime of human trafficking, that in a sense, the lack of enforcing laws makes it open season on vulnerable people. We have an increasing number of vulnerable people, which means that traffickers have an easier time identifying their next target.
Right. I think one of the biggest issues is not enforcing the laws because law enforcement officials are told by the administration right now not to enforce those laws. That's part of the problem. How can the U.S. prevent TCOs from abusing and trafficking migrants?
I think that targeting our investigative resources around the transnational criminal organizations, actually having more dedicated, specialized units that are focused on that, where officers don't have an additional task to investigate trafficking crimes, but instead it's their primary task. If we had focused, targeted, specialized units focused on labor trafficking, as well as targeted units focused on sex trafficking, I think we'd see a significant difference.
And I know it was mentioned in some of the opening statements, especially Mr. Valeda, but perhaps you can expand, Ambassador, on we should have coordination with Latin America in combating trafficking. How do you think we could do a better job of that?
I think we need to continue engaging each country throughout Latin America, encouraging them to enforce their laws. They have signed up to the international convention, the Palermo Protocol on Trafficking in Persons. Make sure that they are being held account to enforcing their laws, both to protect and provide services, but also hold traffickers accountable.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back the last 20 seconds of my time.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Payne, is recognized for 5 minutes for questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I think a point or question that I have in this whole scenario is, unfortunately, the demand for these human beings is very concerning for me in this country. I mean, we're supposed to be the beacon, and yet and still, traffickers are preying on more and more people because there has to be a demand. So that's very troubling to me. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you once again. Human trafficking impacts adults and children. Children have unique needs and understanding. That I offered a bill called the Homeland Security for Children's Act, which was enacted into law last Congress. And I do a lot of my emphasis on this committee around children and their needs. The law required all components of DHS to incorporate the needs of children in its planning and mission execution. Mr. Fitzpatrick, could you explain the importance of having DHS officers take into consideration the needs of children and that are victims of trafficking and smuggling?
Thank you for that question. There was a bill that has passed the House, H.R. 2. Part of it, I believe it's Title V, would streamline the screening of unaccompanied children at the southern border. Imagine you're 9 years old and you don't have a lawyer, you don't have a social worker, you have a streamlined adjudication process. That should not be the way things are for children at our southern border. I don't think that the special protections that Central American children have should be the ceiling, that should be the floor, and others should be brought up to that. Mm-hmm. And so I think that looking at the push factors that cause these children to be sent by parents and to flee Central America or other countries, and then the processing of those children, and to be sure it's fair and thorough and holistic and trauma-informed, and then also the protection of them once they're resettled in the United States and don't end up in meatpacking plants and car factories.
Yeah, and that's my other concern as well. We have a situation here that, requires a lot of concern and thought about what is it happening in those countries that a parent is willing to send their child. I mean, how devastating or distraught a parent must be to have to send their child in those circumstances. So we really need to look at what's going on in those countries as well that makes people that desperate that they're willing to take that chance on their child making it alone. Let's see, recent estimates indicate, Recent estimates indicate that over 3 million children are in forced labor worldwide. The Department of Homeland Security has recognized the work done by the Center for Countering Human Trafficking as a Homeland Security mission in its third quadrennial Homeland Security review. Other efforts such as public awareness campaigns have raised salience of human trafficking in public. Mr. Fitzpatrick, in your testimony, you mentioned that we need to take a whole of government approach to combat trafficking. Could you please highlight actions DHS has taken in this area and that other agencies can learn from?
I've been really quite impressed with the early steps that the CCHT, the Center to Counter Human Trafficking, has taken inside DHS. In particular, there is a dedicated team looking at just labor trafficking and not at sex trafficking. I also think that DHS deserves great credit for its early steps in the implementation of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. There have been thousands of shipments and millions of dollars of goods that are tainted by forced labor. The victims of this crime are factory owners in your congressional districts who have to compete with factories in China that are using slave labor. So thinking more holistically about this as an unfair trade practice and not just as a crime against individuals.
Thank you very much, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Strong, is recognized for 5 minutes for question.
Thank you. Ambassador Richmond, as we know, transnational criminal organizations are well informed on U.S. immigration law. In fact, a Border Patrol agent previously said that cartels even go as far to study it and to find any loopholes they can to exploit it. I appreciate your comments about how exploited vulnerability and lawlessness, how migrants crossing the southwest border are vulnerable to trafficking and abuse. You briefly mentioned in your testimony, but I really want to drive this point home. Would greater U.S. border security and law enforcement impact the cartel's human smuggling and trafficking business?
I think increased law enforcement in enforcing all of our laws, border laws as well as trafficking laws, is going to have an impact on cartels and traffickers' businesses. I think we also want to look at the fact that where enterprises or companies are benefiting financially or otherwise from engaging in trafficking activities, they too can be held accountable under the existing Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And so enforcing laws across the board will strengthen the government's response and negatively impact traffickers. Meanwhile, the opposite is also true, where we've refused to enforce our laws. That works to the benefit of traffickers.
Thank you. Mr. Sadalewski, as you know, human smuggling is often a dangerous, life-threatening process for migrants because they travel through international borders, gangs and cartel territory, or vast jungles. Do you believe migrants traveling on human smuggling routes know the dangers of the journey to the U.S. and specifically the risk of being trafficked?
No, sir, I most certainly don't believe they know the risk. I think that there's a big misconception about the routes, with the exception of Darien Gap. With the exception of there, I think there's a misconception on what the route actually looks like and the dangers that it presents.
Thank you. How does the Biden administration's failure to secure the southwest border facilitate human trafficking?
Well, human trafficking, it's a business. Right now, you know, there's a change from drug trafficking to human trafficking because of the profitability. The border has presented an increased number of people coming across, which is, as a result, increased trafficking.
We've never seen this number of trafficking in history. Do you believe the Biden administration has failed to secure the southern border?
Yes, sir.
I want to ask each of the same. Ambassador Richmond.
I think it's clear that the southern border is not secure and hasn't been for a long time.
Thank you. Sir?
I'm not in the position of make such categorization, sir. But what I do know is that the U.S. administration can certainly do more.
Thank you. Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Depends on your definition of secure. If zero contraband and zero undocumented migrants is secure, then the border's never been secure in the history of the United States, and it will never be. So depending on what you mean by secure, I think is important to take.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, is recognized for 5 minutes for questioning. If she's prepared, would you like me to move on?
I'm prepared.
Yes, ma'am. You are always prepared. Hardest working members of Congress. We
Good to see
recognize the
you,
gentlelady from Texas.
Thank you so very much. This is an area that many of us have confronted for many, many years. Mr. Fitzpatrick, I held a hearing on human trafficking in 2014 with then Chairman McCall. Certainly it is going on a decade ago, but we know that we have confronted this issue over and over again. I'm about to sign a letter dealing with two rules offered by DHS and Department of Labor dealing with H-2A visas. Those are farm workers. And for many of us, our concept, and many of the friends we grew up with or traveled from different places came as farm workers. We remember the partnership between Dr. King and Cesar Chavez, and they were trying to work together for the equal rights, farm workers, and at the time, rights for Negroes, for colored people in the South, across the nation. That's what we viewed America as, giving opportunity where there is need. And I think that we will find that those persons who fall into the depths of being trafficked really are trying to come here to work. They are trying to come here for opportunity. And unfortunately, we hear from the proposed viewpoint of a president that says he's running again, that he will have deportation camps. I can only imagine a nightmare as the world watches and wonders what has happened to America. Unfortunately, I lived through the separation of families a few years ago under the previous Trump era. And I'm very grateful that we have a court settlement filed Monday by the Biden administration, American Civil Liberties Union, concluding a years-long legal dispute after thousands of children were separated from their families at the southern border. I literally witnessed those children when they were making a tempered effort to reunite children and parents, mostly mothers. The children were in shock. They did not gravitate toward those mothers. It was lasting damage that occurred. They didn't recognize who they were. So I'm as anxious about cartels, the viciousness of cartels and trafficking for people who are really trying to come here to be able to contribute. Our farms say that they need more workers. Various other places need workers. So I just want to pose some questions to you very quickly. This is a bigger framework than just talking about who doesn't have resources. We need resources, and I hope my friends will join me as we do the Department of Homeland Security appropriations and that we do the border security package, that we have resources to fight the cartels and the traffickers. That's a big part of it. But we also have to recognize that people are trying to come here to work. So, Mr. Secretary, in your testimony, you mentioned in your testimony that child migrants need to be screened by specially trained border personnel. What are the risks of an expedited screening of child migrants by lesser trained staff? And let me add something else to it. What are the best ways we can aid other countries in curbing the amount of migrants leaving their countries? So one, how do we deal with the children? And then how do we deal with the migrants? I laid the groundwork. I think they're coming mostly not to bring fentanyl. That's another fight. And I will stand with my colleagues, Republicans and Democrats, at the gate, fighting those who are bringing the devastation of fentanyl, which we know is coming through China and then through the southern half of the United States. But if you can answer those two questions, children and then migrants coming from other countries and curbing the amount of migrants.
Thank you for those questions, and thank you for your work on helping to reform the H-2 visa system, because it may be most, certainly many, if not most, people in human trafficking who are migrants in the United States came here legally on H-2 visas and find themselves exploited in those situations as domestic workers, home health care workers, even lifeguards at swimming pools, and farm hands working in the migrant labor system. As I mentioned, it's just when children have lawyers, or when trafficking victims have lawyers, then they have rights. And when they don't and have to stand before an adjudicator and without social safety net, social workers or lawyers, they don't the outcome is not so good. It's hard for them to articulate that they have a credible fear of trafficking if returned to their home country, which is a qualification for asylum status. And so we all deserve lawyers. I mean, you have the right to an attorney, so to speak. So children have the right for those levels of services.
And then migrants, the chairman is being kind, migrants and them coming to the United States.
Yes, it's just trying to streamline so that children can be turned around quickly to deal with numbers is no way to treat a child.
The migrant families coming.
And they should not be separated from their families because the Flores settlement requires that the children receive different treatment than their parents, or that there's some suspicion that children aren't legitimately the children of those parents. I think there's, if you would increase the funding for the adjudicators, the social workers, the judges, that is included in the border supplemental. There's plenty of border guards and other kind of hardened police and border security provisions that are in that bill. I would urge you to please include the other elements that are in the border supplemental as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to ask unanimous consent to put into the record the Forbes article dated October 16, 2023. Biden administration promises benefits and paths to asylum to migrant families separated under Trump. This was a settlement, so this is a responsibility that the administration has to engage in. Thank you so very much.
Without objection. Gentlewoman's time has expired. The gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Brasheen, is recognized for 5 minutes for questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It should be no surprise that policies that encourage the explosive number of illegal immigrants coming across our southern border are also a correlation tied into human smuggling increases, human sex trafficking increases. We went from, in 2019, 45-year lows of illegal immigration to now the highest number in our nation's history, 270,000 in the last month reported coming across our southern border. There is a power differential. We cannot address the world's problems. It's not the job of the United States to solve the world's problems on this. It is our job as members of Congress to address what we can. And what we can do is change those incentives that are leveraging the southern border to be a place where the cartel and other individuals are making money, heightened because of policies that have dramatically changed in the last several years. I was shocked, and I'm going to butcher your name. My last name, Burkeen, is often mispronounced, so I'm going to do my best here. Sadolinsky?
Zadolski, sir.
I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
I was shocked. You represent the American Military Academy. You're a professor there. You talked about, in your interviews, your work on human smuggling, about interviewing a person that was involved in human smuggling, who had kidnapped a 12-year-old child, saw the procedure to extract that young adult's eye, to then let it be sold into the interior of the United States.
Well, sir, to clarify, the trafficker, the former trafficker that I had spoke with, who had been incarcerated, had gotten out of prison, he was speaking about another trafficker. He wasn't the one responsible for the organ harvesting. This was another trafficker that he was associated with, and he was explaining the process of how that works. And the surgery occurred in Mexico. I don't know what happened to the eye.
And so I want to follow up on that. I mean, we talk about the heinous activity of sexual trafficking, but organ harvesting of children.
Right.
Mr. Richmond, you said something that was intriguing to me. So this eye was sold for $15,000, according to your recollection.
That is correct, sir.
$15,000 for an eye. We know that there has been a failure. Not only we have the highest number in 45 years of illegal or 50 years of illegal immigration in this country, down from the 45-year low in 2019. You used a statistic I thought was astounding. You said since 2019, it's gone the opposite direction in enforcement of our laws on convictions under the Department of Justice of human trafficking cases. How is that possible? How do we have the highest number in our nation's history of enforcement or of illegal immigration We know there's a direct correlation, increase in human smuggling, human trafficking, and yet we now have the lowest number of convictions involving human smuggling. How is that possible?
Yeah, there's certainly been a significant drop, I think 48%.
48%, according to
convictions
your
in U.S. federal courts. So that wouldn't cover state courts, but federal courts, we've seen that drop.
Can I interrupt you? Because I want to be clear on this. A 48% decrease in federal convictions involving human trafficking since 2019. In 2019, we had the lowest number of illegal immigration crossings in our countries, that's seen in that time period. So how is it that those numbers had flipped?
I think there's a number of reasons why we've seen a decrease in global investigations and prosecutions, and it's been all over the world, but it's been true here in the United States as well. I think one reason is a lack of specialized units focused on both labor trafficking and sex trafficking that could combat these crimes.
Dr. Richmond, because my time is short, can I ask you a question? Is it also possible that the ability to identify the criminals has also been lessened? I'll give you a quick example, if you could respond to this. The Trump administration initiated something in 2019, keep going back to that year, where it said, we're actually going to extract DNA evidence to find out if this young adult coming with you across the border is actually related to you or not. And as a result of that, in that small sample, they saw the DNA testing showed that 30% of the adults arriving with children were not children's parents, as they had initially claimed. And that simple procedure, trying to verify if this child being brought into the United States by this adult was theirs or not, has been discarded by this administration. Is it possible that we don't have the tools now to identify and back map to those that are doing these criminal activities?
I think it's worth noting, because when you talk about identification, if we have 27.6 million victims in the world, and last year governments globally identified about 115,000, the governments around the world are identifying less than half of 1% of all the victims we estimate to exist. We have to radically increase our investment in combating human trafficking if we're going to make a dent.
Thank you. I yield, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Thanadar, is recognized for 5 minutes for question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A few months ago, after a lengthy 16-hour markup, my Republican colleagues passed the Border Reinforcement Act of 2023 without accepting a single Democratic amendment. They claim the bill is about border security, but it abandons CBPs, ICEs, and DHS, non-governmental partners who provide essential support for migrants. Maybe my colleagues to the right should listen to the agents, because they have said that NGOs are critical to their mission in border communities. NGOs elevate the pressure on our border services, freeing up resources for other vital activities. We also know that NGOs offer enhanced stability to migrants so they do not become even more vulnerable or susceptible to human trafficking. Mr. Fitzpatrick, can you touch on the important role of NGOs play in combating traffic crimes and how basic support and stabilization can help prevent someone from being trafficked?
Thanks for that question. Since I direct an alliance of NGOs, from large shelter operators to groups that work on leadership in this sector on both sides of the aisle, from the McCain Institute to Vital Voices. We're a nonpartisan organization that looks at all the different parts of the problem. There's actually a funding crisis that's going to come. I don't know if you know it, but there's something called VOCA, Victims of Crime Act, which has a funding cliff ahead of it. And we're going to start seeing next year nonprofits having to close operations and lay off staff because it's funded by penalties from federal courts. And those penalties have, from all sorts of civil society, is not enough to meet the current need. Border guards don't want to be social workers. And adjudication judges don't want to be lawyers. for the defense or have to perform that role. And this is where civil society workers come in to help do the support in the processing of individuals as they're determined whether or not they have a lawful right to enter the United States as an asylum seeker, trafficking victim. And so civil society is indispensable because you couldn't possibly do that with all of them being FTEs at the Department of Homeland Security. You need nonprofit groups to get funding, and matching funding is required from other sources and foundations and individual contributors. So it's a cost-effective way to help get the job done, to make sure that people's rights are protected.
Yeah, thank you. You know, as an immigrant, I came to this country at the age of 24. And often, you know, I had to take shelter with nonprofits when I couldn't hold on to a room in a rooming house or had issues otherwise. And I got a lot of help as an immigrant. And I owe it to them for what I was able to do later. So instead of attacking nonprofits and religious organizations doing humanitarian work, what should we be doing in Congress to support NGOs and fight human trafficking?
Passed the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act that actually reauthorizes Ambassador Richmond's old department, his job, which has tens of millions, 96, I can't quite remember the number, but it's a substantial amount. Most of their budget goes out the door to government implementers. Almost all of them nonprofit organizations like IJM that do the work upstream in field around the world. To do what they can on reducing the push factors and also improving the judicial systems in those countries. So it's a cost-effective way to address the problem.
Thank you, Mr. Fitzpatrick, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Goldman, is recognized for 5 minutes for question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for calling this hearing today. We're here, I think, appropriately focused on a significant problem, which is the human trafficking and a corollary, the fentanyl trade that is predominated and controlled by the transnational criminal organizations called TCOs. Mr. Richmond, would you agree that the most powerful TCOs on the southern border are the Mexican drug cartels?
I would certainly think that the drug cartels have a significant impact.
Understand, you don't want to declare without having any background, but the drug cartels have significant control over human trafficking, correct?
I think we have definitely seen cases where drug cartels and gangs have shifted to not just selling drugs, but also moved into selling illegal commercial sex, as well as forcing people to work.
As well as the fentanyl trade that is running rampant, correct? Now, we've had witness after witness come before this committee and testify that the Mexican drug cartels are able to control the border and the human trafficking and fentanyl enterprises because of their access to and possession of guns, especially AR-15 weapons of war. And I assume none of you disagree that the cartels derive so much of their power from their possession of guns, correct? Anyone disagree? All right, seeing none, I will move on. Mr. Villeda, do you know how many gun stores there are in Mexico?
IJM has no information on that matter, Mr. Congressman.
Okay. The answer is one. One single gun store. It takes months to get a gun. Do you know how many American manufactured guns are exported from the United States across the southern border to Mexico every year, Mr. Villeda?
I don't know that.
Well, would you be surprised if I said as many as 500,000 per year? So it follows then, right, Mr. Fitzpatrick, that one important strategy to combat the cartels and disrupt human trafficking and fentanyl trade would be to prevent the cartels from getting access to weapons of war that give them strength and power. Is that right?
I would have to consult my organizations that work on the border in order to give you an opinion.
All right, well, it's fairly common sense. and I'm sure the two subcommittee chairmen who have law enforcement backgrounds would agree that weapons can give a significant source of power to the Mexican drug cartels. Now, if Congress were going to pass laws to stop human trafficking and the fentanyl trade and secure our border against the Mexican drug cartels, wouldn't it follow, Mr. Sadowski, that we would want to stop the exportation of American-made guns going to Mexico?
Yes, it would.
Well, unfortunately, H.R. 2, which Republicans have repeatedly pointed to as their toughest ever border security bill, does not mention guns one time. Not once. So we Democrats are taking action. We are trying to identify real solutions that can get real results. And that's why today, along with my colleagues, Mike Thompson and Joaquin Castro, I introduced the Disarming Cartels Act. This bill would dramatically increase and intensify the Homeland Security's Department's efforts to combat the trafficking of firearms and ammunition produced by American companies and exported over the southern border. My bill would ensure that the Department of Homeland Security increases interagency collaboration to disrupt the flow of arms trafficking, and that we work with our partners in Mexico to identify US-based gun traffickers so we can stop that flow. Now, my Republican colleagues repeatedly sit here, hearing after hearing after hearing, pointing fingers at the Biden administration for all of the border security issues. Well, here's an opportunity to actually do something. And I urge each and every one of my friends on the other side of the aisle to join me and support this legislation that every expert agrees will help to secure our border. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields. The gentleman from California, Mr. Garcia, is recognized for 5 minutes for question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I also want to continue some of this conversation around what's really giving the cartels power at the southern border as well. Now, we know that cartels and RTCOs are destructive. We know what they're doing around human trafficking, what's happening along not just the border, but human trafficking in general is horrific. We can all and we should all condemn just the horror that's happening to so many families, and particularly so many young women. But it's also important that we also focus on ways these cartels maintain their power. And one of the ways that they maintain their power, is, like was just said, is weapons and arms smuggling. So I think that's also very important to talk about. Now, each year, according to CBS News reporting, between 500,000 and 1 million weapons enter Mexico illegally from the United States, from us. We know that many of these weapons are military-grade weapons of war, including belt-fed miniguns, grenade launchers, and a variety of other types of weapons. And the overwhelming majority, of course, end up in the hands of drug cartels. So it's about 1 million weapons a year that actually get smuggled into Mexico from the United States. And we have allowed the cartels to essentially amass arsenals. These are the weapons they often use to traffic human beings, to kill innocent Mexicans and US civilians, and of course that they use to attack law enforcement on both sides of the border. Now, Mexico has been doing their part to solve the avalanche of guns. Like was just mentioned, there is one gun store in all of Mexico, and actually that one gun store only issues 50 permits a year. So we know the guns are not coming from Mexico, they're coming from us. And it shouldn't surprise anyone that according to a variety of reports, anywhere between 70 to 90% of all the guns that are recovered in crime scenes in Mexico are actually traced back to US gun sales. So if we're going to fight an effective fight against the cartels, we need to make sure that they cannot get their hands on US firearms. Now, without even including ammunition and gear, the retail value of US weapon sales, which go to the cartels, is around $500 million a year. So given that, it's unsurprising that according to the Council on Foreign Relations, over 50% of all US firearm dealers and up to 80% of border state federal firearms license dealers are actually dependent on Mexican cartel demand for their economic existence. So if you think about it, 1/2 of all US gun dealers would essentially go out of business if not for gun sales that end up in the hands of the cartels. So this is actually a huge public policy and public health crisis. Both sides of the border need to be involved. And if we actually want to take on human trafficking, The illegal guns that are coming from the United States play a huge role in funding these cartels. They're, of course, trafficking all of these families from Central and South America and Mexico. Now, we know that there has been strong support from the Biden administration. The Bipartisan Safe for Communities Act took an important step in combating firearms straw purchasing and trafficking. That was obviously the first reform we've seen in decades, but we need to do a lot more. I also recently introduced legislation that takes on ammo. It's called the Ammo Act, to reform the way we license, sell, regulate, and oversee large ammunition sales in this country. But we also need to crack down on direct access to these guns by the cartels. Just really briefly, I'd like to go down to all of our witnesses, and I want to thank you all for being here. Would you agree, yes or no, that U.S. trafficked guns are critical to the cartels in maintaining their power? We'll start with Mr. Richmond.
I think, given the fact this is a human trafficking hearing, it's important to note that Congress wisely and innovatively in 2000 passed the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which focuses on nonviolent coercion.
Just back to my question. So yes or no, would you say that guns that are trafficked are critical to cartels maintaining their power? Yes or no?
I think that most traffickers in the world use nonviolent coercion to exploit their victims.
So you can't answer the question? So you don't think that trafficked guns are critical to cartels maintaining their power?
I think this hearing is about human trafficking.
Yes or no, sir? You want to answer the question? Okay, Mr. Villeda, do you think, it's not a hard question, do you think that trafficked guns are part of cartels maintaining their power, yes or no?
Part of the problem, sir, but not the only one.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Fitzpatrick.
I couldn't say one way or the other.
So you couldn't say if guns and gun sales have anything to do with cartels maintaining their power?
Trafficked guns.
Trafficked guns.
That's a subset of gun sales, and I couldn't say.
Mr. Sadolski?
Yes, guns are a problem.
Thank you very much. I don't think that was a very hard question. It's unfortunate that it can't be answered. And finally, just another question for everybody. To effectively fight against cartels, do we need a whole of government approach, which also should include addressing the smuggling of guns? Addressing the smuggling of guns, should that also be addressed to fight cartels? Mr. Richmond, yes or no?
We should enforce all our laws regarding guns as well as human trafficking.
Mr. Villeda?
The U.S. administration should cooperate with local governments.
Mr. Fitzpatrick?
Sure, yes.
And Mr. Sadolski?
Yes, sir.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back. And again, we want to say that we got to really focus on also guns and ammo sales if we want to take on the human trafficking issue. Thank you.
The gentleman yields. The gentlewoman from Illinois, Ms. Ramirez, recognized for 5 minutes for questioning.
Thank you, Chairman Higgins and Ranking Member Mr. Correa. Look, we've been in this committee hearing now for almost 2 hours, and I think we all agree that human smuggling and trafficking is terrible, especially when we're inflicting this pain, this trauma on children. Honestly, it disgusts us. And I am the oldest sister to a little sister who crossed the border in search of her biological mother at the age of 12, weighing 65 pounds. So I would tell you that I have a little personal experience to what happens when a young person is in search of their parent and is coming through a coyote. I also feel like it's a deplorable policy when being trafficked or smuggled seems to be the only way that people can come to seek asylum in this country. And time again, I've heard from some of my colleagues here that, wow, what is the root cause of migration? And I also haven't seen any humane pathways for people to come into this country legally so that traffickers don't continue to marginalize, oppress, abuse, rape, and do the things, deplorable things that they do. So I wanna come back to what I always usually come back to, which is the morality of human life here. Mr. Villeda, you heard one of my colleagues ask the question, what is the root cause of human trafficking? And I heard one of the witnesses mention, well, look, poverty, vulnerability, if they think that they can take advantage of this individual, they will, and they do. So, Mr. Villeda, this is also like Congressman Garcia, it's a yes or no question. Do you believe that we should pass comprehensive protections that give survivors of human trafficking permanent protections to stay and work in the U.S. and seek the resources they need to thrive?
Appropriately screened migrants who have been identified as victims should be given the opportunity to receive proper
So yes,
care.
thank you. Thank you, Mr. Villeda. Mr. Fitzpatrick, what do you think? Yes or no?
That program already exists. There's a T-visa system for that, and it just needs to be expanded and properly funded, yes.
It's expanded and properly funded, but the answer is yes. Okay. Well, Mr. Fitzpatrick, my colleagues on the other side talk about how they care about children. I hear about it all the time here. I hear it on the House floor. But the legislation that they passed in this committee, H.R. 2, I call it the Child Deportation Act, was passed through the House this spring that threatens to shut the government down over what they propose to be the extended amount of time where a child would spend more time in jail. Currently, I think they were talking about custody and CBP from 3 days to up to 30 days. Now, my little sister talks to me about the amount of time she spent waiting to be sponsored and the trauma she's still dealing with now at the age of 29. So I don't believe any children should have to spend one single hour in jail-like setting. But their legislation is asking that happen, and then also talks about deporting undocumented people, and that includes children. So, Mr. Patrick, would forcing unaccompanied children to remain in unsafe conditions without a guardian make them more vulnerable to trafficking?
Yes, it would, and I don't believe that Congress can, by act of Congress, undo a court settlement that the United States has agreed to, the Flores settlement in particular. So to the extent that the law tries to get around what the government has already said it's going to do in a consent decree in court, I'm not sure, I'm not a lawyer, but I'm not sure that Congress can just simply say we're not going to honor that court agreement.
Thank you, Mr. Fitzpatrick. So let me ask you one other yes or no question. Would sending children back to dangerous and deadly situations in Mexico protect them or make them more vulnerable?
Is that a question to me?
That's a question, yes or no. Would sending children back to Mexico in a dangerous, deadly situation protect them?
I'm against sending children back, period, whether it's to Mexico or whether it's to their country of origin. I think sending them to an intermediate country could be even more riskier than sending someone back to their country of origin.
Yeah, I agree. So look, I just want to conclude. I want to see human trafficking end. I think we all do here. We also have to ask ourselves, why are people crossing the border to begin with? And I think a couple of people brought that up here. And I think the final part of that is, it is a policy choice that we don't actually pass legislation that addresses the reason that people need to migrate and creates legal pathways. So I'm not going to back down in the face of relentless attempts to criminalize the right to seek asylum and endangered children in the process. And I really hope that if we're going to be saying we care about children, that we actually address it by policy and create legal pathways so that human traffickers no longer have business. And with that, I yield back, Chairman.
The gentlewoman yields. Seeing no further members present for questioning, I thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the subcommittees may have additional questions for the witnesses, and indeed we do. We would ask that the witnesses respond to these in writing. We'll be submitting these questions in writing. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7D, the hearing record will be held open for 10 days. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned.